So you should have just listened to Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles, the saddest song ever written, especially when you listen to it really, really closely. This is a great example, though, for characterization and thinking about characterization to think about a defining trait. And if you think about both of the characters in this song, because even though it's called Eleanor Rigby, there are two characters, Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie. Both of these characters are united with this one defining trait, which is loneliness. And it just, everything in the song is driving that trait home. It's reminding us of their loneliness. And it's mostly done through imagery. So I especially like using Eleanor Rigby because it reminds you, it reminds me and you as writers of the importance of imagery, and how important it is to show things instead of only telling them. Now I'm not one of those teachers or writers who says show, don't tell, simply because sometimes I think telling's really good, but I do say show more than you tell. So you may want to write that down as well as one of your tips. But just think about all the imagery for Eleanor Rigby: picking up rice alone in a church, waiting at the window, applying her makeup, dying at her workplace, no one at the funeral. So these are all, these all should pop in our minds like little scenes from a movie or snapshots where we see her picking up rice alone in the church, waiting at the window, applying her makeup, dying alone at her workplace, no one at her funeral. We see each of those things and we gather that information and we see how alone she is in the world. At the same time, we see this imagery of Father Mackenzie as well, preaching a sermon no one will hear. He's preaching to an empty church. He's darning his socks alone late at night. It's a really lonesome image. Presiding over a funeral to no one. Wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave. So the really interesting thing about this is you think, well, if only Father Mackenzie and Eleanor Rigby must have been coexisting in that church, but somehow, their paths are never really crossing and they're not connecting. Maybe they could have helped each other in that loneliness and been friends. And especially that image of him wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave, almost this, she's been invisible to him this whole time. And so now, he's just wiping the dirt away. He's already forgotten her completely after having preached her funeral to no one. So it's a great lesson in one defining trait, really showing you a character. It's such a short song, and the lyrics take up, I don't know, maybe half the time that the song is actually playing, because so much time is devoted to the instrumentals. And by the way, the instrumentals of that, the producer wanted to make it sort of eerie and creepy, so he wanted it to sound like the music from the shower scene in Psycho with those violins and all those strings. So that gives it a whole other layer as well. But I just think it's a good way to think about characters and think about that character of Eleanor Rigby. We'll look at a few other examples and think about how all the things we've examined thus far have been put into play. If we think of a really recent popular character who's become really beloved, few loom larger than Katniss Everdeen. She's from The Hunger Games. We love her mostly because she's brave, but she's also afraid. That vulnerability is what we really love about Katniss. Because she is incredibly brave and selfless, but she's terrified throughout the Hunger Games books, and that makes her more attractive to us. We can identify with her much more than if she was just launching into these, battles to the death with other children. That putting her vulnerability on display makes her more human and makes us care about her more. She also has a lot of empathy, and she cares about other people, and we like that about her. She's complex, and that complexity is arrived at through careful characterization on the part of Suzanne Collins You can find an excerpt from that on your handout as well. I protect Prim in every way I can, but I'm powerless against the reaping. I notice her blouse is pulled out of her skirt in the back again and force myself to stay calm. Tuck your tail in, little duck, I say, smoothing the blouse back in place. Pages later, Effie Trinket crosses back to the podium and reads out the name in a clear voice, and it's not me, it's Prim. One time when I was in a tree, waiting motionless for game to wander by, I dozed off and fell 10 feet to the ground, landing on my back. It was as if the impact had knocked every wisp of air from my lungs, and I lay there struggling to inhale, to exhale, to do anything. That's how I feel now, trying to remember how to breathe, unable to speak, totally stunned as the name bounced around the inside of my skull. Then I see her, the blood drained from her face, hands clenched and fists at her sides, walking with stiff, small steps up toward the stage, passing me. And I see the back of her blouse has become untucked and hangs out over her skirt. It's this detail that brings me back to myself. I volunteer, I gasp. I volunteer as tribute. And so, just in case you don't know the Hunger Games, what's happening here is that by lottery, children are picked to go off and fight these battles in a reality game that everybody watches, and you sort of make a win for your district in this dystopian society. And so her little sister that she cares so much about has been chosen by the lottery, but she's taken her place. So it's this great selfless act. And this characterization, and this is really early in the book when we first get into know, where we are first getting to know Katniss. So we have this great little personal, private moment between the siblings that comes back later at the first of this excerpt, and she says, "Tuck your tail in, little duck." And then there at the end, this sort of pitiful image of the little girl being chosen basically to go off and be killed. And the tail of her shirt's hanging out again. So that personal connection speaks to us. And it's woven throughout, that we know Katniss, where it's pointed out that she's in a tree waiting motionless for game. So, we're being reminded of something we've been told earlier, that she's a hunter. And later on, we see that she's scared, but she's still, going to volunteer to take the place of her little sister. So there's real emotion happening there. We're emotionally invested in her. So I think it's a particularly good example of how valuable the weaving of information is for characterization. If you look at the excerpt and think of it in a very surface way, you may not even think that it's an example of characterization. There's certainly no physical characterization going on, no hair color, no eye color, but this is absolutely rich with deep characterization that we as readers tuck away for later use. And it also employs characterization we've been given before, Katniss as hunter and protector, for example, that we're able to act on now as readers. Now I want to direct you to another one of my favorite books. This is from The Outsiders, and another really beloved character in modern literature, Ponyboy Curtis. As I read this, I saw how that defining characteristic is really working and firing on all its pistons in this scene as well. When I stepped out into the bright sunlight from the darkness of the movie house, I had only two things in my mind: Paul Newman and a ride home. I was wishing I looked like Paul Newman. He looks tough, and I don't, but I guess my own looks aren't so bad. I had a long walk home with no company, but I usually loan it anyway, for no reason except that I like to watch movies undisturbed, so I can get into them and live them with the actors. When I see a movie with someone, it's kind of uncomfortable, like having someone read your book over your shoulder. I'm different that way. Nobody in our gang digs movies and books the way I do. For a while there, I thought I was the only person in the world that did, so I loaned it. So we have these really key words that show up throughout this excerpt, or key words and key phrases: no company, loan, undisturbed, uncomfortable, different, the only person in the world. I loaned it. And we arrive at all these words that point, all these words are pointing to an outsider, somebody who's alone, somebody who's different, somebody who doesn't want to be disturbed, who's outside the norm. Um, and that's the really brilliant thing about this novel. It illuminates that everyone is an outsider. While we might interpret the title as pointing to the gang itself, who are the outsiders in this socially divided, tough world of Tulsa, Oklahoma in the mid 60s, here we're being shown that Ponyboy, a member of the gang, is an outsider even within that group of outsiders. And we relate strongly to this because all of us have felt like outsiders at some point. So I think you should also write the word resonate in big letters somewhere in your notes, because that's what good characterizations must do. It must conjure up characters that resonate with the readers, that they can identify with in some way. For a character, we must either identify with them or we must be really repulsed by them. You know, we must object to their MO. Another very memorable character whom we are endeared to, not because we know what he looks like, but because we know what goes on in his brain and heart, is Charlie, the narrator of the novel The Perks of Being a Wallflower. And this is one of the most popular young adult books ever written. And again, this is just full of key words. Some kids look at me strange in the hallways because I don't decorate my locker, and I'm the one who beat up Sean and couldn't stop crying after he did it. I guess I'm pretty emotional. Other phrases in there: I don't understand. I feel sorry. I can't help but love them very much. Trust. Again, we can pull out these keywords to get an essential trait of our character. Based on this, I would say that his defining trait is being emotional or being full of feeling, being really sensitive, something like that. The author knows that Charlie feels everything in a very intense way, and he drives that home on almost every page of the book. We like this about Charlie, and what makes it work even better is that this very trait that we as the reader admire because we have the proper context for it is what makes Charlie an outcast so often in the book. He lives in a world where being emotional is not acceptable, especially for a teenage boy. Yet he is. That's who he is. That's his essential trait. So we also like characters that we can feel empathy for, that we feel sorry for. I mean, you know, classic examples, that would be somebody like Oliver Twist from the Charles Dickens novel. Characters who, you know, have all these obstacles up against them. We identify with them. We love an underdog. It's just a human trait. Most of us do. Now, for a little change of pace, I want us to look at our main character characterizing someone else in a beautiful way. And this is from the novel How I Live Now by Meg Rusoff. It's a book I really love, a remarkable novel you should check out, especially if you're interested in young adult literature. And this is in your handout as well. Now let me tell you what he looks like before I forget, because it's not exactly what you'd expect from your average 14-year-old, what with the cigarette and hair that looked like he cut it himself with a hatchet in the dead of night. But aside from that, he's exactly like some kind of mutt. You know, the ones you see at the dog shelter who are kind of hopeful and sweet and pout their nose straight into your hand when they meet you with a certain kind of dignity, and you know from that second that you're going to take him home? Well, that's him. Then some pages later, and then he gave a little shrug and a little dog shelter dog kind of tilt of his head and opened the door by reaching in through the window. So you see that the character who's speaking has arrived at this perfect image-driven detail to give us, because we all know what that dog looks like. We're all endeared instantly to a dog like that. So it's a wonderful image for a character who's going to become the emotional center of the book, because this is his goodness we're seeing. And so we care about him for that right off the bat. Also, this is a good example of how weaving works, because throughout the rest of the book, she refers back occasionally to this initial characterization to remind us of his shelter dog-like quality, to remind us of the things we associate with good dogs: loyalty, friendship, dignity, goodness. They're all traits that are telling us something really important about our character.